It started in a way that looked almost ordinary. A routine email arriving in a financial office on a busy weekday. The message sounded familiar, the kind of note employees see all the time. An invoice, a schedule update, a document that needed review. Nothing in the subject line suggested danger, but the people behind the Carbanak cyber heists were patient, and patience was their strongest advantage. Carbanak was not a single moment of chaos. It was a long, careful campaign aimed at banks and financial institutions across many countries. Investigators and security teams later described it as a bank robbery without entering the bank because the attackers focused on the institution's internal systems rather than breaking physical locks. Their goal was not to collect customer data for attention. Their goal was money, and they tried to reach it by blending into normal business life. The first step was often human, not technical. The group relied on social tactics, messages designed to feel believable, written with enough realism to pass a quick glance. The attachment looked like a normal office file, and when someone opened it, the computer quietly began running hidden instructions. Nothing dramatic happened on the screen, no loud warning appeared. The user might have thought the file was simply slow to load. That calmness was part of the strategy. Once the attackers gained a foothold inside a network, they acted like observers rather than intruders. They tried to learn how the organization worked, which machines belonged to which departments, where the transaction systems lived, how approvals were handled, and how employees communicated. They were known for taking their time, sometimes weeks or months, because rushing creates noise, and noise attracts attention. From an educational perspective, this is an important lesson. Many high-impact incidents begin with a low-impact moment. The initial entry can be as small as one click, one rushed decision, or one employee who simply wanted to complete a task quickly. In large institutions, the workload is heavy and the pace is fast. Attackers understand this. They don't need every person to make a mistake, only one. Over time, Carbanak became associated with a style of operation that felt unusually inside out. Instead of forcing a system to do something obviously strange, they tried to make actions look normal. That meant watching internal screens, learning routines, and studying the patterns of daily work. If a bank processed payments at a certain time, or if a specific role had access to sensitive tools, the attackers wanted to understand that rhythm. This approach changed how defenders talked about risk. It wasn't only about building strong walls at the perimeter, it was also about reducing the chance that a single inbox message could quietly become an entry point. And it highlighted the importance of internal monitoring, because once a threat is already inside, the questions become different. Who is accessing what? From where? At what hour? With what sequence of actions? In later public accounts, the campaign was linked to losses that could reach very large numbers across many targets. The exact totals were debated in some discussions, but the broader point remained. The incident showed how coordinated financial attacks could scale when repeated across institutions. One success might be a warning. Repeated success across many places suggests a model, something that can be copied, improved, and expanded. The story of Carbanak is a reminder that sophisticated operations can feel quiet from the inside. Employees may not notice anything unusual in the moment. A system can appear to work normally while someone unseen is learning how to imitate it. That is why early detection matters so much. The earlier an unusual signal is spotted, an unfamiliar login, a strange internal connection, a device behaving oddly, the less time an attacker has to learn the environment. And for Carbanak, time was the true currency. They weren't chasing quick wins. They were building familiarity step by step until the institution's own processes could be mimicked. In that calm beginning, the most important event was not a dramatic breach. It was a quiet shift, the moment an outsider began to behave like an insider. After the first entry, the operation moved into a slower phase that looked more like study than theft. Carbanak's reputation came from how closely the attackers tried to understand daily banking operations. They were not satisfied with access alone. Access is only a door. Knowing what to do after the door opens is what turns intrusion into impact. Inside a large financial institution, systems are layered. There are employee workstations, internal servers, transaction platforms, administrative consoles, monitoring dashboards, and approval workflows. Many of these tools are legitimate and necessary. The Carbanak Group's strength was their ability to hide behind normality, using the complexity of a bank as cover. Security researchers later described a pattern. The attackers watched what employees did on screen and learned the sequence of actions that led to a financial transaction. This is a crucial educational point. When criminals can observe how staff members use internal tools, they don't have to invent new methods. They can imitate what already works, repeating approved steps in unapproved ways. They also moved carefully within networks. Rather than switching everything at once, they tried to expand control gradually, one system leading to another, until they could reach the environments used for financial operations. Again, their advantage was patience. If one route seemed risky, they could pause, wait, and try another path later. In complex organizations, defenders often focus on stopping sudden spikes of activity. Carbanak aimed to avoid spikes. From the outside, many people imagine cybercrime as constant technical battles, but the Carbanak story shows that organizational behavior matters just as much. How access is granted, how privileges are managed, how often systems are reviewed, and whether unusual activity is investigated quickly. A bank can invest heavily in technology and still be vulnerable if daily processes allow silent observation and gradual privilege growth. One reason such campaigns are difficult to detect is that normal varies widely across departments. A late night login might be suspicious in one team and ordinary in another. An internal connection between two systems might be routine during maintenance windows. Carbanak operated in that gray area. The more they learned, the more their actions could be timed and shaped to look like routine work. This is where internal visibility becomes essential. Good defense is not only about blocking threats at the front gate, it is also about being able to answer questions later. Which machine first received the suspicious email? What systems did it communicate with afterward? Did it connect to devices it never used before? Did it trigger unusual credential use? In many organizations, these questions are hard to answer quickly. When answers take too long, attackers gain time. Carbanak also demonstrated how risk concentrates around key roles. In financial settings, certain positions have access to tools that can initiate transfers, adjust records, or approve operations. Even if those tools are protected, the workflow around them can be observed and studied. A criminal does not always need to defeat a safeguard directly if they can find a way to imitate an approved sequence of steps. The educational value here is not fear, it is clarity. If we treat every employee as a potential target of manipulation, we can design systems that reduce the consequences of a single mistake. That means stronger separation of duties, better authentication, careful review of administrative tools, and training that focuses on realistic scenarios rather than generic warnings. By the time the Carbanak attackers reached the stage where they understood internal routines, the most dangerous part was not the malicious software itself. The danger was familiarity. The more the attackers behaved like normal users, the more their actions could be lost in the background noise of a busy institution. In documentary terms, this phase feels like the quiet middle of a story. No alarms, no headlines, no visible damage. Yet it is the phase that makes the ending possible. Because when someone learns the language of your systems, your timing, your approvals, your habits, they no longer need to force their way through. They can simply speak the language back to you with a different intention. At some point in the Carbanak campaign, observation turned into action. But even then, the group's approach avoided sudden drama. The goal was to make outcomes happen while keeping the process looking ordinary. This is why the story is often told as a warning about imitation. When criminals learn how legitimate operations are performed, the most harmful actions can be disguised as routine work. Public reporting and security analyses described several ways the attackers attempted to extract value once they had deep access. What mattered most was not the exact method, but the principle behind it. Using the institution's own systems to produce an outcome that looked authorized. In some cases, criminals aimed to manipulate transaction workflows so transfers would be initiated in ways that resembled normal business. In other cases, reports described operations involving cash machines being instructed to dispense cash at chosen times. Again, not as a chaotic event, but as something scheduled, planned, and coordinated. The common theme was control from a distance and timing that reduced the chance of immediate suspicion. For educational audiences, it helps to focus on what this reveals about internal safeguards. Many financial systems assume that if an action comes from the right console with the right credentials during the right window, it must be legitimate. Carbanak challenged that assumption. Credentials can be misused. consoles can be reached indirectly, and right window can be learned by watching routine operations. This is why layered verification matters. Strong controls don't rely on a single factor, such as a password or a workstation location. They combine identity checks, device checks, behavior checks, and approval checks. They also include monitoring that looks for subtle anomalies, a user doing unusual sequences, an admin tool being accessed from a machine that rarely touches it, or operations that match how it's done but not who usually does it. One of the most unsettling aspects, said gently without sensationalism, is how quiet the impact could be at first. A bank could discover irregularities later, after reconciliation or after an audit, when numbers didn't add up the way they should. The delay between action and detection is a key vulnerability. The longer the delay, the more difficult it becomes to trace what happened, because logs rotate, systems change, and memories fade. Carbanak also highlighted the importance of segmentation, keeping critical financial systems isolated from general office workstations. If an ordinary employee's computer can serve as a bridge to sensitive environments, then a single mistake can become a path into the core. Segmentation, least privilege design, and strict administrative boundaries don't remove risk, but they reduce how far a threat can travel. Another lesson is the value of rehearsed response. When defenders detect an intrusion early, the next steps must be clear. Isolate affected machines, preserve evidence, review authentication events, and verify critical systems. In complex environments, hesitation is natural because shutting down a system can disrupt operations. Attackers know this and they plan for it. They count on defenders needing time to decide. In the Carbanak story, the heist element is less about cinematic scenes and more about process abuse. It is a reminder that modern financial crime can be built from patience, observation, and a willingness to operate slowly. For the listener, the key educational point is this: the most powerful security improvements often come from small operational changes. Clear separation of duties, strong multi-factor authentication for administrative actions, frequent review of privileged accounts, strict controls on remote administration tools, better training focused on realistic message tactics, centralized logging, and fast investigation. Carbanak did not succeed because banks were careless. It succeeded because banks are complex, and complexity gives criminals places to hide. When security teams tell this story, they are not praising the criminals. They are describing the cost of allowing a hidden observer to remain inside long enough to learn what normal looks like. And once an intruder learns normal, the difference between normal work and abnormal intent becomes hard to see, unless the organization is prepared to look for it. When large financial incidents come to light, the public often expects a simple reveal, a single culprit, a single method, and a quick resolution. The Carbanak case was different. It unfolded over time, and it involved many institutions, multiple countries, and long stretches of investigation. Security companies began publishing analyses that connected unusual intrusions at financial organizations to a shared pattern, similar malicious code, similar tactics, and similar operational behavior. Law enforcement cooperation also became part of the story, with agencies and investigators sharing intelligence across borders. This is one of the most valuable educational aspects of the case. Modern cybercrime rarely respects geography, so defending against it requires coordination that also crosses boundaries. Attribution, identifying who is behind an operation, is difficult in cyberspace. Attackers can reuse infrastructure, borrow code, disguise their locations, and operate through layers of intermediaries. Investigators often rely on a combination of technical evidence and human evidence, malware similarities, server patterns, timing correlations, operational mistakes, financial trails, and eventually arrests or seizures that confirm parts of the picture. In public descriptions, the Carbanak campaign was linked to a group that operated like a business. There were people involved in creating malicious tools, people involved in sending messages, people who studied banking systems, and people who helped convert the outcome into usable funds. Even if some parts of the operation were handled by separate crews, the overall structure suggested planning and division of labor. From a defensive standpoint, this highlights why one-time fixes are not enough. If an operation is organized, it can adapt. If one approach fails, another can be tested. If one institution improves quickly, another may remain exposed. That is why sector-wide collaboration is important, sharing indicators, sharing lessons learned, and improving baseline security across many organizations, rather than leaving each one to fight alone. Another educational point is how important transparency can be, balanced, calm, and responsible. Institutions face difficult choices when disclosing incidents. Too little detail can prevent learning. Too much detail can create unnecessary anxiety or give criminals ideas. In the best cases, disclosures focus on what matters, what was affected, what protections were improved, and how customers can be reassured through concrete steps. As the investigation advanced, public updates included law enforcement actions connected to the broader network of activity. A reported arrest of a suspected organizer in Spain in 2018 became part of the public narrative. Regardless of how a listener interprets specific claims or totals, the arrest showed something important. Cybercrime investigations can be slow, but they can also be persistent. Years may pass between the first intrusions and a major breakthrough. This is another lesson Carbanak teaches. Defenders and investigators need endurance. Short-term attention fades, but long-term commitment is what changes outcomes. The case also encouraged financial institutions to invest in deeper monitoring and incident response capabilities. If an attack can unfold over months, then security teams must be able to review months of activity, identify subtle patterns, and reconstruct a timeline with confidence. In documentary style, this phase of the story feels like a careful untying of knots. Each institution might see only a piece, an unusual email, a strange login, an unexpected transaction sequence. The investigator's job is to connect pieces across time and space without jumping to conclusions. That is hard work, and it requires both technical skill and disciplined reasoning. For the audience, the heart of this part is not the arrest itself. It is the idea that prevention and response are connected. When organizations improve logging, share intelligence responsibly, and rehearse incident response, they make investigation easier and reduce the attacker's room to operate. Carbanak became a well-known name not only because of the scale described in public reports, but because it demonstrated a style of crime that many feared would become more common: long-term infiltration, careful observation, and imitation of legitimate operations. The investigation showed that such campaigns can be uncovered, but usually only after a long, coordinated effort. After a high-profile campaign, the most important question is not how did they do it. The more useful question is what changed afterward. The Carbanak story became a teaching case across security teams because it emphasized a specific risk: criminals trying to behave like insiders. Banks and financial organizations responded by strengthening multiple layers at once. One lesson was the importance of restricting how office email attachments could execute hidden behavior. Another was hardening internal access, limiting where employee workstations could connect, and tightening rules around administrative privileges. The campaign also pushed institutions to improve detection based on behavior rather than signatures alone. Traditional defenses often look for known malicious files. Carbanak's approach suggested that the most dangerous phase might involve legitimate tools used in unusual ways. That means detection must consider patterns, unusual connections between systems, rare administrative actions, and sequences of steps that are technically valid but contextually strange. Another shift involved privileged access management. In complex organizations, privileges can expand gradually as teams add tools, integrate vendors, or respond to urgent needs. Over time, this can create accounts with broad permissions that are rarely reviewed. Carbanak reinforced the idea that rarely reviewed and high privilege is a risky combination. Regular audits of privileged accounts, strict approval for administrative changes, and clear separation of duties became even more important. The case also strengthened the push for strong multi-factor authentication, especially for administrative actions and remote access. A single compromised credential should not be enough to reach the most sensitive systems. Device-based trust, step-up verification, and tightly controlled admin pathways can reduce the chance that an attacker can imitate an internal operator. Training also evolved. Instead of generic warnings like "don't click suspicious links," better programs focused on realistic messages that match employees' daily context: invoices, HR notes, meeting agendas, vendor documents. Carbanak's early steps were persuasive because they looked normal. Training that reflects normal life is more effective than training that only describes obvious scams. From an educational angle, it is also worth noting the psychological pressure in large institutions. Employees are busy, they process many messages, they work under deadlines. Attackers exploit those conditions, so defenses should not rely solely on perfect human judgment. They should design systems that assume mistakes will happen and limit the consequences. Carbanak also influenced how institutions thought about internal monitoring. It encouraged more robust collection of logs from endpoints and servers, better correlation across systems, and faster investigation workflows. If a suspicious email is reported, responders need the ability to trace what happened next without days of delay. Speed is not only about stopping damage, it is also about limiting how much the attacker can learn. In calm, documentary language, we can say this: Carbonac's impact was not only financial, it reshaped habits. It encouraged banks to treat internal networks less like trusted space and more like a set of monitored zones. It accelerated the movement toward zero trust principles, where access is continuously verified rather than assumed. The public also learned something from the case. Sophisticated cybercrime can target institutions that appear strong. This is not a reason for panic, it is a reason for continuous improvement. Security is not a final state, it is a practice. The question is not whether an organization can be perfect, but whether it can detect quickly, respond calmly, and recover confidently. Carbanak became a warning that criminals may try to learn routines and mimic them, but it also became evidence that defenders can learn too. Every incident teaches patterns, every investigation improves methods, and every improvement, repeated across an industry, reduces the room criminals have to hide. The Carbanak story remains relevant because its core idea is simple: trust can be copied. When a bank's internal actions are predictable, an intruder who studies them can try to imitate them. That does not mean trust is wrong. It means trust must be paired with verification. In the years after Carbanak became widely known, the financial sector continued investing in stronger controls, better intelligence sharing, and improved response readiness. Yet the lasting lesson is not limited to banks. Any organization that handles payments, approvals, or sensitive operations can learn from the same pattern: long-term infiltration and careful imitation. From a documentary perspective, Carbanak is also a story about time. The attackers used time to learn. Defenders needed time to investigate. Law enforcement needed time to coordinate across borders, and the industry needed time to strengthen practices and share lessons. This is why the most practical takeaways are not dramatic. They are steady, repeatable habits. Organizations should reduce the chance that a single email can lead to deep access. They should keep critical systems separated from everyday workstations. They should tightly manage privileges and review them regularly. They should log important events in a way that supports fast investigation. They should train employees with realistic scenarios, and they should rehearse incident response so that when something unusual happens, the team can act with calm clarity. Another lesson is about responsibility in storytelling. When we talk about real cyber incidents, it is important to describe them in a way that educates without encouraging harmful behavior. The Carbanak case can be told as a cautionary tale about how criminals exploit routine and familiarity without turning into a guide. The purpose is prevention. There is also a human lesson. Behind every successful cybercrime campaign are many human decisions. An employee opening an attachment under pressure, a manager approving a rushed process, a team postponing a security upgrade because operations come first. These decisions are understandable. Work is demanding. Resources are limited. But criminals depend on predictability and pressure. That is why security must be designed to support humans, not blame them. Carbanak also reminds us that the end of a public story is not always the end of the risk. Even when investigators report major arrests or disruptions, organizations must assume that similar tactics will be reused by others. A famous operation becomes a template, not only for defenders learning, but for criminals attempting to repeat what worked. This is why defense must keep evolving. In the calm tone of an educational documentary, the conclusion is this. Carbanak showed that the most damaging intrusions may look like normal work until it is too late. So the goal is to make normal work safer by narrowing privileges, strengthening verification, improving monitoring, and building response muscle. The true victory is not in one investigation or one arrest. The true victory is in raising the everyday standard across an industry so that patient, imitative intrusions become harder to sustain. When institutions shorten the time it takes to detect unusual behavior, attackers lose the one resource they value most: time. And when time is no longer on their side, the quiet beginning cannot grow into a quiet, costly ending.